Hello, my name is Donna Lee. I'm with Vaughan Public Libraries. I'm here today to talk to Jocelyn. Jocelyn is a young engineer working in our community. Also, a couple years ago, Jocelyn became a parent, and a few years ago, Jocelyn transitioned from male to female and is here today to tell us about their transitioning journey. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us here at Vaughan Public Library to share your story with us.
Thank you, Donna.
So thank you for joining us. Just to let people know, can you please let us know why you've chosen to stay anonymous during this interview today?
Right. So, as Donna Lee mentioned, I recently became a parent. So, to make sure that the internet can't find out who my child is, we're using just a name, a single name, and we're not recording my face.
Thank you very much for joining us to tell us about your experience. Could you please tell us how old you were when you first thought that you might want to transition?
Yeah. So, when I was very young, I had these feelings of jealousy for other girls, and I kind of imagined, what if I were a girl? That would be amazing. What if I could have magical powers and change myself? But I didn't really understand that was. I kind of considered it to be this pipe dream, this thing that can only exist in my imagination. And as I didn't really know what transgender people were when I was a child. And as I started to see people in media, they were always the villain or just kind of a joke. And I learned that societally, it's not okay to be transgender. And I kind of internalized that lesson. So it took years and years later of discussions with my friends, my spouse, who at the time was my long-term partner, and self-reflection to kind of overcome those internalized biases, I guess, to decide that actually transitioning is an option for me and something that I do want to pursue. There was a time when I was, I think, 8 years old, that my mother actually asked me about it, and I said no. I said absolutely not, because by that time I had already learned that it was shameful. And I think back to that, and I think it's probably, considering the world that we live in when I was young, it's probably good. It was probably good for my safety, but I also kind of think, what if, right?
Thank you. It sounds like it's been a journey that has taken a very, very long time. What was the hardest part about this decision during this whole process?
Yeah, I kind of alluded to it in the previous question. It was overcoming that sort of self-imposed barrier, those stigmas that I learned from society, and deciding to take that first step. I had a lot of apprehension. There were, of course, I was an adult, so my questions were more along the lines of, what will this mean for me professionally? What will this mean for my job? What will this mean for my housing, perhaps? Because I rent, so will my landlord, legally they can't evict me, but that doesn't always stop somebody from making your housing situation uncomfortable and convincing you to leave, making it easier for you to go. So those were kind of my fears, and I had some personal fears as well. What if someone in my family rejects me? What if I lose some friends over this? And it really took coming to the conclusion that it is more uncomfortable not to transition than to take those risks.
What would you say was the biggest challenge that you've had to face since you began?
Since I began transitioning, it's finding out what things are possible. Transition isn't just a switch that you flip and suddenly you're the opposite sex. That's not that's kind of the idea that you get from what you see about transgender people, but it's really not. There's any number of things that you can do without any kind of medical intervention. So we call it social transition, things like changing your name, changing your mannerisms, the way that you walk, the way that you talk, the way that you move your hands, the way that you dress, the way that you listen to the world around you, are all things that are part of my transition, and maybe part of other people's, that didn't even occur to me when I was a child, right? I just sort of assumed it was all part of one package, one essential thing that is boyhood or girlhood when I was a child, when I was that young, manhood or womanhood. And then learning about things like hair reduction and removal, facial hair particularly. Learning about things like there are surgeries, there's hormone therapy. There are various different things that different people do, and some people do more or less of them. So kind of sifting through all of that and finding out, interestingly, there's a vocal surgery that I'm probably not going to do. But when I learned about that, I was like, oh my goodness, there's a whole nother thing I have to figure out. So deciding what to do, in what order, how to pursue it, and the legal side of things, changing my name. That's actually still an ongoing process. It's one of the first things that I did. But your name is in so many places in the world. Anywhere that you've ever registered, like your email, anywhere that you've ever signed up for a card, right? Like a loyalty card, any group that you're a part of, you have to come out to them and you have to go through whatever process to change your name there. On all of my ID, I had to update all of my ID. And that meant that I had to go through this lengthy process of sending in my all of my original ID to be destroyed and then hope that I got some back. So following through on finding out about and then following through on all of those steps has been probably the hardest thing.
It certainly sounds like it's quite a journey. So on your journey, have you encountered hostility or transphobia, or have you felt supported?
Right. That question is very binary, and the answer is yes to both, and from the same people sometimes even. So, including myself. I talked about how I had all of that hesitation when I was much younger, and all of that internalized transphobia is what it was. And so I've been very lucky. Everybody that I care about or who has been important or impactful to my life has accepted me to one degree or another. But they've certainly been very accepting directly to me. And the kind of transphobia that I do experience is more often well-intentioned. Things like, oh, make sure that when I came out to my coworkers, some of them said things like, oh, make sure that you don't just jump into any surgery and that you don't regret it. And I was like, well, I don't know. I've been thinking about it for 30 years. I don't think I'm jumping into anything. But it's all kind of from a space of caring about me and making sure that I am safe, and will be happy later in my life. But before I transitioned, actually, I was exposed to a lot more transphobia, kind of incidentally. I think about coworkers, not that I'm currently working with, but that I worked with years ago, who would casually talk about slurs for transgender people, and I'm not going to repeat, and kind of expose their disgust for particularly for transgender women, because we're kind of the most visible of transgender people, and I guess it seems like the most transgressive to a lot of people. But now I don't really get that. The worst that I get is probably when I'm going around in public. Sometimes I'll be usually this will happen in a store. I'll be speaking to somebody, one of the staff, and they'll call me sir. And I'll be wearing a purse, I'll be wearing makeup, I'll be wearing a dress, I'll be speaking like this. You can hear, and I think it's kind of this misplaced trying to be like, I've lost the word, polite, this misplaced politeness, right? When I'm very visibly not conforming to masculine gender norms. That's probably the worst of it. Some other things are in public, like people will sometimes stare at me. And usually if somebody is staring, they're not also going to speak to me. So I don't know if they're just staring because I'm particularly tall, or they've never seen somebody who looks like me before. But no real open hostility, I guess, that I've experienced directly. The internet is entirely different. There's a whole lot of hostility on the internet, but none of it is really directed at me personally, because I try to keep a low profile. Yeah, I guess that's my answer.
So I know that part of your story is that a couple years ago you became a parent, and I was wondering if you had concerns about explaining your family situation to your child someday, explaining that you're their biological father, even if you're not in that role. So I was just wondering if you had concerns about having that conversation, and if you had concerns about your child's family experience.
Right. So the word father it can be a thing that is related to the sex of the person, but the way that it's used really is more of a gender thing. It's the parent who is a man, right? So I don't think that I would ever use that word when I'm talking to my child about myself. If you think about, there are cisgender. I should explain cisgender. Cisgender is just the other relationship to gender that transgender people have. So I was born and I had male on my birth certificate, right? But I've transitioned from that gender. Cis, the prefix just means the same. So people who are the same gender as they were assigned at birth are cisgender. There are cisgender women who are mothers and who did not give birth to that child. They may have used a surrogate. Some mothers do. And so I wouldn't really use the word father, right? I'm still their biological parent, whether I did give birth to them or not, and I'm a woman, so I'm their mother. But I think what you're really asking about here is when, if I should talk to my child about, when I'm planning to or expecting to talk to my child about, that I am transgender. And I don't have a time in mind. This is something that I'm sure eventually they're going to ask me about it. It might come up. They might have friends at school who see me and ask them about it, and then they may have questions, right? Or they may learn about it some other way. So it's really going to be driven by when they decide to ask me. And then I'm sure it's going to be kind of a long discussion. And by a long discussion, I mean it'll take years. We'll talk about whatever comes up when it does. And then over time, as they develop more understanding of the world, of people, I'm sure there will be more that they want to talk about with respect to my being transgender. What does it mean? In a very basic sense, is how I'm going to start discussing it. But then what does it mean with respect to whatever other questions that they have and whatever boundaries that I set up about that? I'm not going to talk about surgeries with my child, for example, or I hope I don't ever have to. But yeah, it'll be a long conversation over years. I'm not really apprehensive about it any more than I'm apprehensive about talking to them about, the healing process when they eventually get a significant cut, like on their knee or something. It's just something that will be a talk that we have to have.
Thank you. You're certainly making it very clear that this is quite a journey. It's not just it's never just a quick thing or a quick decision. It's been quite a process, quite a journey that's continuing. So knowing that it is such a process, such a journey, when you look back, if you were to look back at the beginning of your journey, is there any advice that you would give to yourself? Knowing what you know now, is there advice that you would have given to yourself when you were younger?
Right. I said earlier that it was probably safest for me that I did tell my mother no when she asked if I wanted to transition. And I think that's probably, if I'm looking back at when I was growing up, I don't think that I would change anything. I don't think that I would try to give myself any different advice than I sort of took in over time. Part of that is knowing that I turned out to be fine and that I was able to transition in adulthood. Because I would be afraid back when I was young to give myself advice that would lead to exposing myself to the kind of transphobia that existed back then, that was more prevalent back then. When I was a child, I was bullied. I presented as a cisgender boy, and I tried to embody that to the extent that I could, to the extent that I was comfortable to do traditionally masculine things. But I was still bullied over my femininity. At one point, I had a set of bullies who liked to throw rocks at me, who liked to call me gay as a pejorative, because they perceived something different about me. I'm not sure if they clocked that I was a transgender woman who had not yet kind of come to that conclusion and come out, but I didn't really fit as a young boy, right? So if I had come out and undergone a social transition at that age, which is all that like an 8-year-old would do, I think I could have actually been in real danger. from these bullies, or from perhaps adults in my life who may not have understood or may not have been able to put aside whatever prejudices that they may have to deal with a child. So to myself at the age that I was, no, I don't think that I would have any advice. But if I were growing up now, I would tell myself to find some friends who will support me through difficult times. Make sure that they're people who demonstrate that, like, check your friend group. When somebody has a problem, how do they react? Are they helping to resolve the problem? When you're talking to them and the person who has had whatever difficulty isn't there, are they talking about them with empathy? Do they change their behavior when that person's not there in a more hostile way? And you want to find somebody who is consistent, who's supportive when the person is there and when they're not. And then you know that you've found somebody who it's safe to talk to about difficult things, such as questioning your gender. That's probably the biggest advice, to find somebody safe to talk to. If you are worried about puberty, there's drugs called puberty blockers, which are essentially, they prevent your body from, I don't know if it's producing the hormones or receiving the hormones and responding to them, but like the ones that you naturally produce, but it prevents puberty from progressing as long as you're taking these drugs. And then when you stop taking them, your puberty just kind of picks up right where it left off. And they've used this for decades now to treat a problem that some children have, where they, perhaps as young as 3 years old, begin going through puberty too early for their body to handle it. So these drugs are safe. They've been used for years. Kids have taken them and then grown up and just been fine. And so that's something that if I were approaching puberty now, I would want to know about, so that I could stop it. I guess the other advice that I give myself is to do all of my homework, even the like really, really boring stuff, because that's kind of the most important part of doing homework when you're a kid, is learning how to do something that you don't want to do. It's not really related to being transgender at all.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn, for sharing your story with us today. This was very insightful and really thoughtful, and I'm very appreciative of this. So thank you very much from Vaughan Public Libraries, and I'm hoping that hearing your story just helps people be more understanding and to realize that this is not a decision that is taken lightly by any means, and but it's a very personal decision. It's a very personal story. It's a very personal journey. So thank you very much for sharing this and sharing your insights and for sharing your long, hard fought for relationship with yourself, right? That you know, right? Because that's so important, your relationship with yourself.
That's a really good way to describe
and
it.
That's what you've been developing and working on. So thank you for sharing this with us.